All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm Chelsea Horn, a professorial lecturer in the Department of Literature, and this session is on social media and discussion boards, engaging students in online discussions. So the overall, the session outcomes here are to examine some of the, I put in quotes, the laws of the online platforms in depth. Secondly, to evaluate the differences in platforms' design, structure, and guidelines and how this may affect discussions online. And lastly, to generate some ideas for in-class activities and/or semester-long projects to engage students with discussions online in various capacities. So that's the plan. So to start off, let's cover the good, the bad, and the ugly of our current internet realities. Sometimes easy to focus on some of the more problematic challenges and obstacles, but I think it's important to identify that there's some really wonderful things that are happening thanks to the internet and connectivity. So we have this techno-utopic dream that the internet is going to be a great equalizer that connects the world together, and it provides more information to more people. And we have this movement called access to knowledge that's doing just that, giving more information to more people. And we've seen some good results of connective action thanks to the internet. And here in this very famous New Yorker cartoon, we see the image of a dog on the internet, and he's saying that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And perhaps that was once true, but that's no longer the reality. In fact, not only do they know that you're a dog, they know what breed you are, what kind of dog food you buy, where you buy it, how much you pay for it, how often you get it. So they know quite a bit about who you are and what you do on the internet. So there's been this radical shift in the way that the internet has been viewed and how we understand it and how we navigate it. So the bad, there are lots of trolls online. There's unfortunately a lot of hate speech, spam. We're in the midst of a disinformation crisis, particularly when it comes to COVID right now. There's a lot of harassment, and the internet sometimes, and social media in particular, does amplify human behavior, both for good and for bad. And then we have the ugly here. So there's a digital divide. Not everyone has access to the internet, and not everyone has equal access. There's a lot of social media bots that are confusing and flooding the internet and social media with disinformation. We have deep fakes. This is one of my favorite examples of a deep fake in a comical sense, but it could have very nefarious effects in other in different situations. But here we have Steve Buscemi's face superimposed upon Jennifer Lawrence's face. And then we have biased algorithms, which we know have real life consequences. DDoS attacks, so distributed denial of service attacks, which those are used to bring down websites and affect freedom of speech issues. There's a ton of cyber vulnerabilities. We also have to deal with surveillance capitalism and data exhaust. This is a concept from Shoshana Zuboff, where it's as we're navigating the internet, yes, we're getting a lot of information, but they're also gathering a lot of information about us as well, and profiting off of that, profiting off of our data exhaust. So all of this leads to that we are in a digital literacy crisis. This is our current reality. So much of our life and learning right now is conducted online. So this is something that we have to deal with, both in our personal and also for us in the educational world. And there are a ton of fantastic technology and resources available to enhance learning, which a lot of educators are taking advantage of, which is fantastic. At the same time, we also have this critical opportunity to incorporate a discussion and demonstration of cyber hygiene skills and digital knowledge skills. So this image here, what we're seeing is a Pew Internet Research study where they asked US adults various questions about digital knowledge. And I just want to highlight two here. So I don't think you can see my cursor, but it's the fourth one down here, where the statement is, privacy policies are contracts between websites and users about how those sites will use their data. And if you look at the results here, nearly half of the respondents were able to weren't sure or incorrectly identified that statement. That's problematic. Nearly half of users don't really know what a privacy policy is doing. And then the second one I want to highlight is the second to last one here, where it's a statement that private browsing mode only prevents someone using the same computer from seeing one's online activities. Only 24% of respondents here were able to correctly identify what exactly is private browsing mode and what it does. So there's this huge digital literacy and digital knowledge lack that needs to be addressed. All right, moving on. So what does this mean for educators? So we can use the online world to build community and engage students online. So here I have the Writing Studies Program Learning Outcome. We have 4 main ones that we try to accomplish in Writing 100 and Writing 101. This one is one I think goes beyond just the Writing Studies program, and one that as educators are really trying to focus with students. And that's that writing requires entering an ongoing conversation. So this can mean writing like an academic paper, writing like a tweet, writing like a discussion board. It means that the work that students are doing are beyond just a monologue or a statement set into the vacuum of nothingness, but rather it has consequences, it has meanings, and they're contributing to, hopefully, the advancements of knowledge. So it's this framework of thinking about the work that students are doing as a conversation rather than just a unique singular entity at a time. And the engaging with these online conversations, both in discussion boards and in social media, really taps into, in different ways, this idea of continuing an ongoing conversation. So let's look at learning management systems. I'm primarily using Canvas because that's what we're switching to, and social media. So this is more broadly applies to social media at large. I'll be focusing primarily on Twitter, but this does apply beyond that. So looking at discussion posts, they're semi-private in the sense that it's just the course and the class within that course has access to that discussion post. Semi-private in the fact that they're not anonymous necessarily in that course. They have their name attached to what they're saying. Social media posts, on the other hand, are public. For the most part, they're available to the global internet community at large. The audience for discussion posts are in Canvas is the classroom community. They're not seeking to participate in a community beyond that classroom community. Whereas in social media, you're going for a global community. They also have in Canvas a contained environment. It's just within that class. There's ideally no outside influences coming in beyond just that classroom. Whereas with social media, you're in the wild. Like you're having to deal with all those concerns, those bad and the ugly components that I mentioned before, which are problematic, but also a challenge of everyday life and something that students need to learn how to navigate. And then discussion posts, they follow traditional classroom constraints where you're engaging back and forth within the classroom. And you usually have an unlimited amount of space. Typically, there is a word count that's recommended, but in theory, you have unlimited space. Whereas on different platforms, you have various rhetorical constraints. So on Twitter, you have a maximum of 240 characters. And then the last difference that I want to highlight here is that they're both asynchronous, so discussion boards and social media, but the asynchronous works differently. With social media posts, there's this concept of kairos, so posting something at the opportune moment, taking advantage of the timing of something that's somewhat unique to social media as opposed to discussion boards. So are you responding to a tweet within an hour, or are you responding to a tweet from 5 years ago? There's different stakes involved and different efficacies. So when we're looking at both discussion posts and social media, we need to look at the pedagogical goals of why we're including them into our syllabi. I recommend them being used together as opposed to just having a social media component, because there's very different goals that we're aiming here. So for discussion posts, we're aiming to build a classroom community. It's helping to both supplement and support the classwork that we're doing in right now, our virtual online classes. And most importantly, it provides a space to think through complex ideas. So this is an environment where, with the support of classmates and the support of the professor, the students can work through their thoughts and develop their thoughts in an organic and contained environment. Whereas in social media, your audience here is the global community, so you're working on networking and you're building this online identity and in the sense of community. Here, you're also practicing effective communication and rhetoric online. And lastly, you're practicing navigating the complex digital sphere through both content and form. So this is information literacy in practice. And so here, that's on the next slide, so let me get to it. So my recommendations when thinking about including social media in your syllabi is these 4 things. So be transparent why you've selected a certain platform. Different platforms have different guidelines and policies, different affordances. So it's important to, I think, to explain to students why you're selecting a specific one. So for example, I include Twitter components into my classes. And I explain to them that it's because it's primarily text-based. So I teach writing and literature classes. There's a robust academic community on Twitter that's sharing information and advancing knowledge. Twitter has certain moderation practices that yield really interesting class discussions on what students think about these moderation practices. Twitter also has data analytics, so you can look at the tweets and see how the global community is engaging with your own tweets. And there's also a transparency report that Twitter provides that demonstrates how they are moderating, what kind of requests they get, and it's really useful to unpack that transparency report. I also recommend that if you are including social media, you ask students to create a new profile, so that way you can separate both the professional life from the student's private life, because I think that separation is really important when it comes to developing an online identity and practicing the ideas and the rhetoric of how they want to use to communicate. Also, to put a focus for students as they're being involved on social media on professionalism. So I tell students to curate their account like a LinkedIn profile. So they're not sharing necessarily what they ate for breakfast that day or other daily life activities. They're focusing primarily on the professional interests that they have as a student at this moment. And I also encourage the students to focus on in their social media posts on less controversial topics. So here we're just practicing navigating the digital sphere and practicing the digital rhetoric online. And so in this case, on the other hand, the discussion posts are the better locale to try out complex ideas, perhaps topics that might be more complicated and controversial, because that's more of the safer environment to try out ideas and think through thoughts. Whereas the social media is a place to practice communication and digital sphere navigation. So just a quick context, I think it's important to include context when we're discussing social media. It's often considered or called a public sphere or a public square. And sure, that it sort of is, but because not everyone has access due to either to the digital divide, it's not quite a public sphere that completely unifies everyone together. So that's something I think it's important to keep in mind. Also, just for context and size, Facebook has 2.7 billion users, whereas Twitter just has 320 million. So it's significantly smaller in user size. And then lastly here, another study showed that while most users rarely tweet, the most prolific 10% of tweeters create 80% of all the tweets from adult US users. So in theory, everyone has this ability to democratically be able to participate on Twitter, but the reality is that there's a very small percentage of people who are those top tweeters. And that's an interesting thing to consider when we're looking at how Twitter is being mentioned in the news, how people are using it. And it leads to productive conversations about how and what is the role of social media today. So some ideas for engaging in digital literacy pedagogy. I have 4 here. So one is like to talk about theories, looking at the network public. How do people share information? How do the different platforms allow information sharing? So Twitter added something where before you wanted to share an article or something, it sends up a little flag and asks you, have you read this article? Do you want to read it before sharing it? So we can have conversations about how networks work and how information is shared. Secondly, we can look at online identity development. So here I have Beyonce's, the top of her Twitter account here, and we can see that she has 15.7 million followers, only following 10 other people, doesn't have a bio, does have images, but has only tweeted 19 times, and the most recent one was in May of 2020. So how are people of different from all over representing themselves online? How are you choosing to curate your profile? And then we have a way of practicing online. So tweeting versus retweeting, commenting on something. How are students using both content and form to engage in this ongoing online conversation? And lastly, you can analyze. We can look at metadata. So here, this is the Twitter analytics. This is just one tweet, and you can see all the different ways that Twitter provides information. You can see the overall impressions, how people engaged with that particular tweet, how people, if they wanted to click on it, if they went to your profile afterwards, how they liked it. You can really examine the effects of a particular tweet. And then lastly, this allows for an understanding of what I call digital currency. So it gives students an understanding of the value of their likes and retweets, the ways that they choose to spend their time and energy and engagement online with others. That's a kind of digital currency. All right, so just some of the internet rules here. So first, copyright is not new or unique to the internet at all, but looking at Canvas, and this is the image that we have here, Canvas is asking us to engage almost daily with copyright, where we're looking at when we have to post something, we have to manage the usage rights, and it's something that, at least on Blackboard, was not as common. So we have to think about copyright, and are we following copyright law when we are posting things? And secondly, we have Section 230. And so this is part of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And it in effect says that it's a shield law that protects platforms from liability, so that users can't sue Twitter or Facebook for the content that other users post. This is part of a really rich and robust discussion right now on Capitol Hill, and something that's well worth following and understanding that this is something that really allows the internet to function the way that it is now, for better or for worse. And then the last rules of the internet that I want to look at, and we'll look at more in detail here, are the platform's community guidelines. This, in effect, is for each platform that you're on. Those are the main rules that we have to follow here. So I have a poll set up. So if we could possibly share the poll here. And the question is, and be honest here. Do you read the privacy policy, the terms of service, and community guidelines for the different platforms, the different apps, the different products that you use?
Okay, I'm gonna start the poll here, right?
Yes, please.
Okay.
All right, we're nearly there.
Yes, only 3 left.
But I think that we can end the poll here and then share the results. So thank you for your honesty. So we see that no one has said yes. and the most of part, people have said no, that they don't read them. And that's the reality that we're living in. So congrats and kudos to the 15 that you occasionally skim them. I have news for you though, they often change. So even if you read them and you skimmed them when you first sign up for a particular service, it's very likely that by now that it has changed very differently since when you first read them. So things do change here. So lucky for all of you, we now have an opportunity to engage with, I'm going to stop sharing the results here, to engage in a communal collaborative work to look at these privacy policies, the terms of service, and the community guidelines. Because there are really, for most of the platforms, these three things that we're dealing with. And these are the rules of how we're navigating that platform. And yes, it's exhausting. And so that's one of the things that possibly you'll note, and this is why we're going to break up into different groups, is we're dividing and conquering here. So we'll have, I think maybe a couple of groups doing the privacy policies, others do the terms of service, and other ones do the community guidelines. And we're going to read through them and divide it up here. So I think I have the guidelines here. Yes. So spend a few minutes reading the section that you're given, and then discuss amongst your group what are the main takeaways of the terms of service or the privacy policy, whichever one you're reading, and really think about like what surprised you the most and why. Or on the other hand, if things didn't surprise you, why not? So it's try really and engage with this. So this activity is meant to both be informative and help demonstrate what's going on online, but also it's a good way of modeling an activity that you can do with your students. Because if you're asking your students to engage with a platform outside of Canvas or Blackboard or a piece of technology, I think it's really ethical and necessary to work with them to show what exactly you're asking them to get into. And then lastly, we'll come all back together as an overall group. And so be prepared to give a very, very brief summary of your group's reactions to each of these various policies here. So I'm going to exit out here. And then I'll put in the chat the three different links. I believe that when you're assigned to the breakout room, your breakout room will have a title, and so you'll be randomly assigned to one of these policies. So I'm going to put them here in the chat.
Just let me know when I should open the rooms.
Yes. Okay, so in the chat, we have the different policies here. So let's do for 15 minutes, and then we will regroup. Maybe let's do 10 minutes here, because I think we have a little bit more direct participation here. So let's aim for 10 minutes. So yes, if you could do the breakout rooms now, that'd be great. But I want to hear some of your reactions. So group one, how would you summarize, and what were some of the key takeaways or surprises for you?
Someone pointed out legal language. We were group one, right? I just want to make sure we were group one. It was Adam who pointed out legal language and how it can be used in such a small way, but put us in a bind. Like the word including, it doesn't mean that they've told us everything that is part of that sentence. And then if you don't realize that, if you don't realize the information that's not there, you really aren't being told the truth about what you're getting yourself into.
Okay, so looking at specific rhetorical language here, because you were the privacy policy, correct? Yes. Okay. So, and in general, like, how would you say it was easy to read, difficult to read? How would you qualify it?
There's a lot of information to where it was overwhelming amount of information. So I think someone with a like an average attention span will probably try to skim those things instead of like thoroughly reading every single thing. Because there were 6 different like subsections, and then it will be like subsections in those subsections. So it was a lot to take in.
Yes, so overwhelming is a great way of describing it, and how students often describe it too, that because it's overwhelming the amount of information you have. The privacy policy, for those who didn't have it, it's color coded. It has numbers 1 through 7. It has nice colors, big fonts, but it has a lot of information. Fairly simplified language compared to the other ones, but still you need to be careful about what it is you're exactly reading, as Christian pointed out. Looking at the specific language. Okay, good. So group 2, so terms of service. What were your key takeaways or anything that surprised you?
Well, we commented on that it was more readable than we thought it would be too. It was, easier to comprehend. And then we talked a lot about the sort of tension between them saying, well, this is your content, it's your responsibility, but we can also do whatever we want with it. And so this sort of ostensible control of the customers, but the real control lies with the company. And there are a couple other points too. So somebody else from my group should weigh in on this too, because I'm probably missing something.
We talked a little bit about, how a lot of times these terms and services make it so that these platforms could potentially profit off of your work and then not have to give you any sort of, what's it called, residuals, or what's the check that child actors still get? What are they called?
It's residuals. Residuals is the right word.
Residuals? Okay.
So I was going to say, I would have said probably just going to pay you for the work in general. But yeah, if you want to get, because I'm not sure technically it's residuals, but yeah, it's the same. The idea of they can use your work without paying you for it.
Yeah. We talked about, I talked about how BuzzFeed, gets flack for essentially having whole articles made out of other people's tweets, versus how news organizations will ask you, can we show your tweet? Can we show your video? Can we show your photo? And I wonder if it's because the tweet is different intellectual property than the photo or the video itself.
Yeah, and so there's big questions about intellectual property and copyright here. I mean, the point that Lacey was making, that was one of the terms of services, like the content that you post on there, they have access to. I mean, they do need that in order to be able to allow your tweet to be posted. But it did lead to a lot of confusion about who owns the copyright. You do, when you create something, you own the copyright and it is your intellectual property. But it's more difficult to follow up when this overall network, where the information is going and who's using it. So it does lead to questions of who owns ideas. TikTok's really interesting in that way too, where an Instagram Reels, someone will start off doing a dance or a trend, or I don't know what the cool name is, what they call these things now, and then other people will duet it perhaps, or they'll just completely appropriate it and make it seem as if it's their own. So there's really interesting conversations to be had about intellectual property and originality, both on Twitter and on other social media platforms. So excellent points. So I want to get to our last group, and then maybe we'll have a few minutes for any questions, but of course you can always email me too. So thank you. And then our last group here for community guidelines. Overall reactions, anything that surprised you?
Well, we were also surprised that the text was more user-friendly than we would have expected. It didn't have a lot of legalese. It was concise. It was presented with a lot of white space and bullet points. It was surprisingly easy to read and understand. So that was one of our takeaways for sure.
Good, yes.
And also the variety of topics, including recent ones that were added for COVID, for civic impact, the election. So it's like an organic document. And Twitter, in this case, lets you bookmark it and save it. It also asks for feedback. Was this helpful? So it seemed like they're trying to make it useful and they're trying to improve it. And as Jocelyn said, it was very easy to read. It was almost enjoyable, the color, the graphics, the layout, as opposed to the user license agreements, which are, a nightmare written by a lawyer for other lawyers.
Yes, and the community guidelines, the Twitter rules, they call it, there are a bunch of links. So you click through if you want to look at for harmful content or hate speech or civic integrity. So you do need to interact with it a bit more. It's also an incredible amount of information. I mean, if we think back to when Twitter and Facebook and those similar platforms first came about or really started to rise in the late 2000s, they either didn't have these sorts of community guidelines or they were literally one page. And they were very, very short and they were very broad because there was this ideal of free speech and it'll be fine. And we see that especially in the past couple of years, it's been an organic process, as I think Scott mentioned, but in the past couple of years, we've seen these really intricate, in-depth, complex, nuanced guidelines. And it's interesting to watch this growth, but also to see what are the kinds of speech and content online that people are concerned about. Because they're, for the most part, these guidelines are reflections of public concern. And so we can see the direct interaction between user concern and platforms. Now, we can also have conversations later on about how effective we think that they are, or if we agree with those decisions, because that's why we have different platforms. So Parler has very different guidelines than Twitter does and a lot of other platforms. And so users decide which guidelines they like or don't like, and they make decisions on their platforms based off of that. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important if you want to include a social media platform in your classes, that you need to read these policies, so understand what you're getting yourself into, what you're asking your students to get into, but also to really critically think, what are the things that I value as an educator or as a citizen even? And is this platform achieving those goals for me? Or is it possibly potentially putting myself and my students at risk? Or like other critical questions like that. So I am conscious of the time, but are there any questions from any of you? So I'm looking at Laura Gibson's, I'll just read it out loud. I try to use Canvas discussion boards in a class this past semester, especially for students who did not want to speak in class. Participating in class either via in-class discussion or in the discussion board was part of the student's grade. Students did not participate in discussion boards. Is there a way to encourage students to participate in discussion boards? Beyond incentivizing through the grade and encouraging and demonstrating this as a way of building community classroom, those are the two real incentives, the real carrots that you have, because I don't think punitive things will be particularly useful there. I think that you're doing right now everything right. So I wish I had a magic solution for you.
No, thank you. That was helpful. No, just this was my first semester teaching, so I wasn't sure, like, was there something I missed? And it may have just been, every class is different. This may have been a group that felt more comfortable speaking in class. And if I teach this again in a few years, I may have a group that's more comfortable in discussion boards. I mean, every class is different. So it may have just been kind of the combination of personalities in the room. So no, thank you. That was incredibly helpful.
Yes, and Cortland has a fantastic suggestion of allowing maybe 5-10 minutes at the end of class or beginning of class to allow them to complete that discussion board. And so it shows that you have the pedagogical influence and that you really want to emphasize that as a key component to the classroom. So that's a fantastic suggestion. So that's why I love this conference, because we get all these really smart people together, working together on this. So thank you. All right, so we are
I just shared the evaluation link. So I just want to everybody, try to participate in the link and evaluate the conference.
Yes, and so I also just want to wrap up because I know that we're right at time. So I want to say thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you for your willingness to participate in what may have appeared at first as a tortuous activity, such as reading these policies that we usually avoid. But I hope that you're able to see that there is value here, and also this is a possible activity that you can include in the classroom. So my email is, I'll put it in the chat, is Horn, it's just my last name, @american.edu. Please feel free to email me with any questions or concerns or comments or suggestions or anything. But thank you again for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Please fill the evaluation.
Yes, and
Where-
please fill out the evaluation.
Where is it? Is it in chat?
Thank you very much.
Yes, I just shared the link in the chat.